So this here VTuber model has been a poor example of my work for quite a while now. And that sounds a bit extreme, but there is a lot of things about it that I don't like being a representation of me and my work. See, this was the very first model that I ever made. I fumbled my way through making the base in Vroid, exporting it out to Blender while having no idea what I was doing, modeling the extra parts in Blender. There's gaps, especially around my face, where you can literally see straight through the model on certain angles, as well as the mouth isn't fully connected either. There's some rigging and weight issues around the shoulders and underarms, but let's be real, who doesn't have weight issues around their shoulders? And not even in a joking or out of context way. There's just a lot of movement in these areas and it's difficult to get nicely and smoothly. I did my best, but now it's time to take everything I learned and do even better. So hey, I'm Bella and this is my version 3 model and how I made it. Now be prepared because this is 34 hours of work condensed down about as much as I can. I've tried to include a little bit of everything, skip the boring stuff, but hopefully just shows you what goes into the full process. I actually have a video on making my version 1 model. That was in May of 2022. That was just making a base in Vroid, going to Blender to add in horns and clothing, and that was pretty much it. After a little bit, I decided to upgrade to what I called a version 2 model. It's not like it was drastically different, I just fixed up a couple of the glaring issues and I added in the AR kit Blendshapes for some fine-tuned facial movements. If you aren't familiar with what that is, you can use newer iPhone models that have the face recognition feature in place of a webcam to track so many different things, from the inner eyebrows raising to the outer eyebrows raising to mouth corners lifting, upper lip rolling, eye squinting, all of those little things. There's 52 of them in total. But I added in all of these blend shapes into my basic figure model to give me much better tracking and called it my version 2. And that's the model that you've seen in pretty much every video for the past 2 years up until this one. Now that I'm done rambling about my past models, let's move on to the start of today's show, which is version 3 model. Again, I didn't take a lot of drastic redesign measures. I'm not a concept artist or great at designing in general, but it was a perfect opportunity to improve and change up some design elements as I went along. Basically, for the past year now, every time I see something about my model that I need to fix, or I have an idea to add, or just something I want to change about my model, I write it down so that way I don't forget it. And so now I have this big list of things that I can go back on and start putting into action. The first main things to fix up are the gaps in between the different parts of my face. Because this is a Vroid based model, it exports out into different sections that you don't necessarily see. But technically the head isn't attached to the neck and the back of the head is a separate piece as well as the ears are separate. It's just something I didn't take into account originally. So when I was adjusting the different facial features, some of these pieces started to separate and I just didn't notice until it was too late. Easy fix, they don't have to be separate pieces, so I just merged them together to avoid any future issues, and now my body and face is all as one piece. Another big thing that I wanted to do was merge all of my textures to get rid of any unnecessary ones. Again, because it's a Vroid based model, this has so many individual texture files for all of the different pieces. Like the body has one texture, the face has another texture, the mouth has another texture, the eyeline is another, the eyelashes are another, the iris, the highlights, the pupil, the sclera, they're all separate individual images. Not only is this more difficult to work with, but I feel like it's not very optimized either. I'm trying to think ahead more when making my models, so thinking ahead for this one, I will have a texture that's just for the main body. The face can still be a second texture, a third for the clothing, a fourth for the hair, and that should be all that I need. Although I did actually, now that I'm rereading through this, I did use a fifth one for Sophie. She wasn't an afterthought, but I wasn't thinking about her at this point. I changed up my eyes a fair bit. Originally they were just kind of my style that I had developed over my years of doing 2D digital art, but I wanted to have them be a bit more of an anime look to them. I just really love the eyes for 2D VTubers. Some artists just do an outstanding job. And the highlights in my eyes were actually mirrored, which bothered me, so I fixed that up too. A new thing I started experimenting with in my recent VTuber models has been more physics-based eyes. Again, taking inspiration from more 2D VTubers. I actually love the more over-the-top physics and eye animations. Not the super over-the-top ones, they are a bit much, but it is impressive. So I split up the highlight texture into a way that I can use it later. For little details like the eye creases and the eye line, which again are on their own separate textures, they don't need to be, so I just painted them onto the face texture and got rid of the extra geometry. Another thing that really bugged me about my model was the nose. I don't know why I drew it the way that I did. I think at the time I may have wanted to go for a more stylized look and less anime, but in the end I'm going back to a more anime looking nose to better suit the style. My model's mouth was also quite tiny and looked out of proportion to me, so I made it bigger as well. I started merging all the clothes pieces into one texture when I decided to experiment with some different clothing options. I do like the outfit that I had, but I just wanted to see if I could come up with something that I liked better. I went through a couple of different half attempts before landing on this simple shirt with a heart cut out in the chest. It's just a little bit of a softer vibe than my old outfit top. My method for making the top is my go-to. It very rarely lets me down. But this one is a little bit messy. So to start, I have a vision of what the shape will be, and I select part of the body in the shape of the top and duplicate that part of the body, and then make it into an object to become the clothing piece. I converted it all back to quads so that it's easier to work with, and this actually wasn't the original idea that I had for this top, because I was just making it up as I go along, which is why it's in a little bit of a weird shape. But it will be starting to come together soon, don't worry. I chuck a shrink wrap modifier on that bad boy so that no matter what, the top will still form to the shape of the body underneath. Of course, this is really only going to work with form-fitting or semi-form-fitting clothing, but I modify it a bit later to make it a bit looser after the modifier is applied. Another helpful tip is to have face snapping applied. It's this little magnet at the top middle-ish of the screen that you can't actually see on my recording, but my monitor is not the standard 9:16 resolution. Rest in peace. Anyway, I have an epiphany of what I'm going to do with this top, so I make some outlines for the general shape and then fill in what I'm missing, which is always fun trying to Tetris everything in. I don't claim to be perfect or an expert or anything that I do ever, so yes, the topology is a bit of a mess, and no, I don't really care. I'm just trying to keep it relatively neat and pay attention to how it's going to deform with the arms and neck and such, but outside of that, it doesn't really matter to me. I make a little heart cutout, and to add in more detail for the hearts, that way it's nice and smooth, I just split the faces back to an existing vertices, so that way every face is still either a quad or a triangle. And now the shrink wrap modifier can be applied, I go in and I refine the shape of the top, making it a little bit looser in some places. One thing that I did really like from the original design was the extra little straps or strings or ribbons, whatever you want to call them. Totally unnecessary to function, but it looks cute, so I wanted to add some back in for this design as well. My original model does not have a tail, and that was really only because I forgot to make one, but I am a tiefling, so I've had a lot of time to decide on what kind of tail that I want, and that is a simple tail with a heart on the end. I like the look of tails that go down towards the ground rather than up, but 99% of the time you're only going to be seeing my model from half up, and I want my tail to be seen, so this is the compromise. To get a nice smooth shape for the base of the tail, I figured this would be easiest with a curve rather than poly modeling, and then once it's converted to a mesh, I can use the shrink and fatten tool with proportional editing to create a nice smooth taper. The heart at the end I just freehanded. I had a visual of the shape, and that was that the main tail part would kind of crease into this puffy heart tail shape, and I hope that comes across. I will warn you that there's a little bit of jumping around with the earrings here. I cut it down to just the relevant footage, but I ended up making 3 different sets of earrings, and the final 4th set, which is what's on my actual model, is just kind of a mashup between the 3 different sets. I really liked this original big heart hoop earring. I have a set similar to them in real life, so they were carried through all 3 sets pretty much. I just changed up the original top ear cuffs to be 3 smaller rings, just to break it up a little bit and be a little bit more dainty. Chains are always fun to make. I like to do it in a segment of 3 low poly torus shapes that are rotated around. 2 is fine, but I feel like it looks a little bit more repetitive than if I was adding in a 3rd. I make a curve that the chain will follow, put an array and a curve modifier on the chain segment. This chain isn't actually the one in the final design. I ended up experimenting off camera a little bit, but this is what design 1, 2, and 3 looked like. Now that I think about it, I don't think I liked anything from set 2, but I really liked the dangling chains with the hearts on the end in set 3, and it was just a little bit too much all in one. And finally, I wanted to upgrade the silver to instead be gold. I think it works better with my design and I can carry the gold through all the other elements in my design as well, which you will see in future. To make the skirt, I take a band of faces around the waist to use as a base. This will mean that the vertices from the extruded skirt will line up to the base mesh, which means not only less clipping in general, but with the rigging and movement too. I ended up making 2 different skirt designs because I wasn't exactly happy with the first one. That is to say that the footage is a little bit back and forth here as well, since I only kept what was important. This first skirt was a short one-sided pleated skirt with just some simple bummer shorts underneath. There's a belt that holds it together with some gold hardware. The second design, which is the one that I kept in the final outfit, I kept the belt and the hardware bit, but I extended the skirt down to the floor, made it sheer, and it has an open panel at the front rather than being half on the side. I always make sure to include the little details like the belt loops for the belt to go through, and the belt has a little bit of an extra flap sticks out, and I'll add a little bit of physics later to it so that way it jiggles. Shoes are always so fun to model. I did bring in a reference image of some standard looking platform boots. I couldn't ever really align them to how I wanted them to sit, so in the end I kind of just compromised, split the difference, and used them as a loose reference. A cylinder helps me get the bulk of the calf section down, and then I just extrude out certain sides to form the silhouettes from the different angles. I just kind of wing it and fill it in, I guess. I originally didn't want to do the same kind of design as the reference pic that I put it in, so I started making shoelaces instead. I didn't get very far, I just kind of didn't really want to model shoelaces, so I reverted back to the leather bands with the buckles kind of situation. As with the belt, all of these little buckle bits have a little extra leather sticking out the side, which I'll add in a bone into each one to give them some jiggle as well. And now we have come to arguably the whole reason this whole redesign happened. The hair. See, of course, I had those issues that I needed to fix up anyway. But did I mention the art that my friend Hello Mimi's made for me? I don't want to say it was the inspiration, but they just took what I already had and made it 100 times better, and as soon as I saw it I was like, yes, this is amazing and exactly what I wish I could have done with my original hair design. My original hair was made in Vroid, so it has its limitations. This time around I went with the curves method of making hair, by making each of the individual strands with Bezier curves. I use a circle curve to act as a cross section, or the bevel, to give it a bit more shape than just round. And I experimented with something a little bit different by adding in a few extra disconnected pieces into this cross section. So the result is an extra flat strand alongside the main one. The 2 big tips that I can give with working with curves, especially for hair, is that when you think you want to rotate a curve, what you probably want to do is to twist it with Ctrl-T. That will give you a lot more control over how the curve sits. And while scaling a vertice doesn't actually do anything, using Alt-S will, and you can actually taper it and make thicker and thinner strands. I am absolutely not going to be showing you the whole entire process for this hair. You've seen the work that goes into making just a couple of strands. Pretty much just times that by about 20 or 30, I don't actually know how many strands I have in my hair. A lot of the strands are just duplicated and adjusted a bit to save on time and effort, and the main bulk of the hair is mirrored as well. I just make sure to add in some non-mirrored strands as well, just especially around the middle to make it a bit more organic and natural looking. Once the main base of curves is all done, there's a lot of work to do in refining and fixing up little things here and there, and I go through and UV unwrap at the same time. I have a rough idea of how I want the finished thing to look, so early on I make a rough texture made up of different sections, so that way I can see things come together as I go. The main thicker strands that form the bulk of the hair are going to be pretty simple, just a white texture with some strand details in it. The 2 little fringe strands that cover my face are going to fade to transparent towards the end, kind of similar to like a 2D VTube effect. The last main texture that I need is one with visible white strands on a transparent background, and for this I have an area of more concentrated strands and areas of finer strands, that way I can pick and choose what looks best for each 3D strand. A big thing as well, if you can remember that each strand has a little extra detached bit in the cross section, I make sure to take each of these and separate it a bit more from the main strand. This just makes it a lot less dense, a little more organic, and overall just a little bit floofier. These are the strands that are going to be mapped to the transparent strands section to add a little bit more like flyaways and loose strands. And hopefully it just adds more to the overall look. With all of these hair curves now as a mesh and refined and UV mapped where they need to be, I can take the rough texture now that I know that it works, and create a more refined texture. It's very easy for white hair to look grey or dull, so the shading and the strand details are more of a saturated pinkish colour. And fun fact, the hair actually isn't white. I try and stay away from bright white and pure black as much as possible, unless it's part of the shading. So the base of the hair is kind of an off-white or a light grey, so that for the highlights I can go in with an actual bright white. This wasn't quite impressive enough for me though, so I experimented a bit with a kind of prism or a rainbow effect around these highlights, and I think that just elevates it so much and it adds in some colour that is pretty subtle still. One last small detail for the hair is that I add in some pink shading at the roots, not exactly to act as hair roots or regrowth, but more to blend it into the skin colour a little bit and just soften it. But that's the big task of the hair complete. It's one of my favourite things about this whole model, and I'm not ashamed to say that I'm proud of it in the end. Now it's time to texture everything else that I have got going on. Starting off with the earrings, even though I've got a pretty good idea of how to paint gold, I made sure to bring up references to see how the shading kind of wraps around different forms and shapes. The clothes are up next, and I always make sure to not only just shade the shape of the object, but also add in any seams and shading for that too as required. A thick hem around the sleeve cuff and the bottom of the shirt, a seam where the arm connects to the main body, a seam on the underside of the arm and down the shirt, just that kind of thing. It just adds some more detail to an otherwise plain shape. Because the skirt is sheer, not a lot of detail will be shown in it, however I added in just a little bit of shading, enough to just highlight and shade the loose pleats. I don't really know how else to explain it. From here it's pretty much just all the same though, shading and adding in detail, just adding texture to each piece as I go. I've got a pretty simple outfit and colour palette, so it's a little repetitive from here, so I'll skip ahead. A lot of people don't like rigging, and I guess I can see why. It's a tedious process and more of a technical one than a creative one, but I personally enjoy it. I don't quite have to think too hard about it, and it's great seeing the whole thing all come to life after standing in a T-pose for so long. I'm basically just ignoring the hair for now, like I usually do, and I'm going through all the little bits and pieces that I want to add motion to. The tail is a big one. I may have added a few more bones than I needed here, but worst case it'll just give me some smoother movement. Then all the things like the buckle flaps and the boots and the belt, they only need one bone each since it'll just be a little bit of wiggle to make it a bit more dynamic. The chain on the belt is another one and is a little bit tricky since it has 2 anchor points. In this kind of situation in the past, I would have put 1 or 2 bones from each anchor point and kind of meeting at the middle, but I didn't really like the end result of that. One side could move one way and the other side could move differently, making the meeting point in the middle like super stretched out. So this time I opted to have just one bone that is anchored to a point pretty much between the 2 chain anchor points. I just kind of split the difference, and this bone extends out to the chain itself. That way the bulk of the chain is moving and pivoting from this average point, and I don't think the final outcome of the movement is too bad. I want the skirt to be super nice and flowy, so I put in a couple of bone chains for each side that goes from the top down to the floor. This will mean that each section gets their own physics and it won't all just move as one piece. The earrings are another big one here. For the dangling hearts, I do 3 bones in the chain and then a 4th bone in the heart itself. The looped chain, I did the same thing with the bone chain where I split the difference between the 2 anchor points and just had one bone that will control everything. The big heart hoop just has 1 bone because I don't actually want it to deform in the shape, I just want it to move and pivot from one spot. I think I'm going to leave out all the rigging for the hair too. It's the same as I have always done for all the other hair that I've done in every other model, and it's just more of a tedious and repetitive process than a difficult one. And now that is the bulk of the work done for my main model, it's time to make a special little friend. So this is Sophie. She likes to hang out with me while I work, and you can usually see her on cat cams while I stream. Sophie also loves to hang out on my shoulders. She just loves it up there. Our morning routine is when I wake up, she comes out from wherever she's been napping, meowing as she runs up to me. I put her on my shoulders and she just gets such enthusiastic affection while I walk around getting ready for the morning. She just loves it, and so I thought it would be super fitting to have a little cartoon Sophie also sitting on my shoulders. That way she can always be with me. I'll be honest, I didn't really come into it with a plan. I only ever modelled one cat before, as an abomination many years ago when I first started 3D modelling, so I will admit I was a little bit nervous. And it's definitely a trust the process here. It definitely does look a little iffy at the start, but as you can see, she turned out fine. She's fine. I started in a brand new Blender file to keep things nice and clean, and I'll append it to my main model file later when I'm done. I start out with really basic shapes with a subdivision modifier to block out the basic forms. First the head with just a few loop cuts and extrusions to make the snout a rounded but not sphere shape. The ears are a plane, again with a subdivision, and I give it a solidify modifier to give it some thickness. After I apply this, I can go in and then more manually adjust the thickness and thicker and thinner in some areas and just give it a nice shape. I modelled her mostly already in pose, which is something you don't normally want to do. Modelling a character in a T-pose or an A-pose is normally best. That way it's more neutral, and when rigged it has smoother deforms, especially in places with creases or high movement areas like underarms. In Sophie's case, I'm only going to be having her in one position, which is this laying down position, so I modelled her in that position directly. The pose will change a little bit later, but this just means less messing around trying to get those high movement underarm areas rigged and looking nice in this position when I don't need them to be extended in any other position. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. I think she really started to come together when I added in the little details like her little 3D nose, her whiskers, and her eyelashes. I would have absolutely loved to add in some little teeth as well, so that way she has an adorable little smile, but let me tell you the reason why I didn't do that. You see, Sophie is a rescue cat, and she's only 3.5 years old, almost 4 now, actually. To make a long story short, at her last vet checkup, her gums were a little bit irritated, so they put her under to get her teeth cleaned. At this point, they didn't expect anything to be wrong, but I got a call saying she would actually need some teeth pulled. And they couldn't do it that day because they needed to pull 21 teeth out of her little mouth. So now she is all gummy and only has a couple of teeth left at the back of her mouth, so while putting teeth on her model would have been absolutely cute, it's just not true to her. And don't worry, she's fine. This was a few months ago now and she's recovered well and still manages to chew through things, whether it's food or cardboard boxes. She's learned to adapt. Anyways, she has a really basic rig because she's not actually going to move or be posed much further than she already is. Her legs get a little bit of a wiggle in them, and then the ear tufts, whiskers, and eye highlights, but that's it. I think I made her coat a little bit too light here. Last year, I took some really good reference photos of her, so that way I had a solid of the left side, the right side, the front, back, top, and belly photos to always have to reference. But that was taken during the winter time, I think, and so her coat was a lot lighter than it is right now. I darkened it up a little bit since then, but this is what her coat looks like now, so it's quite a bit different. I do find her markings quite difficult to replicate. She's a tabby, but she's also got some tortoiseshell markings with little orange patches. She really is quite special, but she is a pain in the butt to draw. I think I got her spirit down at least though, so that's enough for me. Attaching her to my model was really easy, just a little more tedious one. Lots of fiddling and finagling to get her to wrap around and sit on my shoulders and for it to look right. It's not exactly the most realistic positioning. In real life, I normally hunt her for a little bit so that way she can balance properly, but in real life, I'm also not a pink tiefling with horns and a tail. Surprise! One of the last things left to do is my blend shapes. Because I changed up the shape of my face a lot, especially my mouth, which included fixing up a lot of the seams around my mouth, I found it easier to just start over from scratch rather than try and fix all the already existing blend shapes. Not only that, but the AR kit blend shapes that I did on my last 2.0 model version are lost to the void, so I had to redo them anyway. So it was a good opportunity to start fresh. When making the blend shapes, I find it super helpful to hide certain parts that aren't needed for that blend shape, or to keep parts unaffected. It also means that I can use a much larger proportional editing radius without affecting all the other parts of the face. Once the main mouth shape is in position, I can make sure to adjust the teeth and the tongue as needed. The simple tracking that normally comes straight out of Vroid Studio and you can do with just a webcam includes the mouth sync shapes for the different vowels and different emotions like anger, joy, sorrow, and they are either hotkeyed or you can train the tracking to pick up on your own expressions and to show them accordingly. The AR kit tracking, however, includes 52 new shapes that are more fine-tuned. Things like the inner eyebrow raising, each eyebrow raising and lowering, each eye looking up, down, in, out, each eye squinting, the mouth corners moving up or down, that kind of thing. It's a lot more work to set up, but this tracking can provide a lot more movement to an otherwise stationary or neutral position. This kind of tracking does best when used with an iPhone, since the eye facial mocap can track each of the points in the face quite acutely, though an Android can still work, it's just not quite as fine-tuned. Just for reference as well, I do use an Android phone for my tracking, and personally I think it does a pretty okay job. I should mention as well, most of these blend shapes are split into left eye up, left eye in, right eye in, etc. So I'll make a blend shape with mirror editing enabled, so both eyes will be looking in, then I duplicate the blend shape, turn one into the left and the other into the right, then select one side of the face and revert back to the basis shape key. It just makes work a lot simpler, and I find that the mirror shape key doesn't always work very well, especially in my case where my base model isn't perfectly symmetrical due to something going wrong way back in the original model that I didn't quite fix properly. The Unity portion of the model to finally put everything together is honestly quite the task in and of itself. There's still some things I don't quite understand, and so I find myself having to go back into Blender, fixing up something, then exporting it to Unity all over again, doing that a few times. Yeah, it's good fun. Even just yesterday, I wanted to add in an animation sequence. See, before I set it up so that way Sophie would blink whenever I blinked, which was fine, but it did feel a little bit too much. So I added in an animation sequence that lets her blink independently, which was a whole ordeal, and I had to go back to the very early stages to fix something, which meant re-importing and redoing all of the physics bones and setting up all the blend shapes in Unity again, but I think it was worth it in the end, and I can finally call this model complete. I cannot stop fawning over this model. So much love and time and effort went into it, and it's literally everything I ever dreamed of. Minus one or two things that I'll be adding in the future, like maybe some other poses and animations and maybe some alternative outfits. Cough, the black chain dress, cough. But thanks if you stuck around and watched the whole video. I really appreciate you spending your time with me, and I'll see you in the next one. Oh, and I guess I'll show the full body view as well, so that way you can appreciate the full thing. I zoomed out too far. But boy, while I'm editing this, boy was it a jump scare to see my original model again. The improvement is insane.